Welcome to Conversations in Process, hosted by Jay McDaniel and co-sponsored by the Cobb Institute and Open Horizons. These conversations explore a way of understanding and living in the world that emphasizes the continual becoming and fundamental interconnectedness of all things. But they're also intended to provide an ongoing interaction in which the stories, insights, and wisdom of each conversation partner can expand your horizon and enrich your journey in process. In this conversation, Jay visits with Charles Eisenstein. On his website, Charles describes a lifelong journey of discovery, beginning with an early interest in the big existential questions. Where did I come from? Why am I here? Where am I going? To his undergraduate studies in math and philosophy at Yale University, his work as a translator in Taiwan, and a part-time instructor at Penn State University. Of that period, he writes, "An irrepressible feeling, I am not here to be doing this," took control of my life. It was during his late 30s that Charles came to the insights that he spent 4 years articulating in his first book, The Ascent of Humanity. That experience of writing and what he describes as the reordering of his world eventually brought him to his current path as a speaker, essayist, and author of more books, including Sacred Economics and The More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible.
Hey, Charles. Thanks for being with us today. And
Hi, Jay.
I'm really looking forward to this. When I read More Beautiful World, More Beautiful World Our Hearts Know Is Possible, I read it with my Whiteheadian eyes, and I thought, he says so much better what I'd like to say than I or other Whiteheadians say. So I'm just looking forward to getting to know your ideas and forming a few bridges with Whitehead in as much as is possible, but not necessary. So presuming that the rest of those listening in don't know your thought as well as hundreds of thousands do know your thought, could you provide just a little introduction to us?
Yeah, well, the overarching theme of my work is basically it's about the changing mythology that runs our civilization, or the transition in our defining narratives that happens through a process of breakdown, of disintegration, of a space between stories, and then the birth of a successor to the world-defining stories that we carry, but I would say that carry us today. And one way that I describe it is it's a transition from a story of separation, a separate self in an objective world of other, to a story of interconnection, interdependency, interbeing. You could also say interbecoming, because when you understand that existence itself is relational, then you no longer can think in terms of separate concrete selves having relationships, but it's more that the relationships create the selves. If you wanted to bring it down to some foundational bottom, it would be more accurate to say that than it would be to say separate beings having relationships. Like, what is elemental here? But even that whole rubric of find the elemental thing and build up from that, in a subtle way, that is part of the old story too. And here I'm already getting really philosophical, but basically what I do in my work is I apply that frame of a transition in our stories to different issues: economy, technology, politics, medicine, whatever. I found it to be a very useful lens to understand what's going on here and to draw parallels and connections among phenomena that can be quite disturbing and despair generating until they're understood as part of a larger movement.
Did this insight emerge for you suddenly or gradually? Can you say a word about how you came upon this insight that's so important to all of us?
Well, I think that this insight is an emerging field. So I'm certainly not the guy who invented this idea, but many people have been thinking and thinking along these lines and seeing different parts of this structure emerging through the mist. So even, and I'm not necessarily directly influenced by people like Whitehead or David Bohm or Lewis Mumford or Ilya Prigogine, but in some cases directly influenced, in some cases indirectly influenced, just because they've become latent in the intellectual culture. So I'm Lynn Margulis. I'm drawing on these different people. I like to use the metaphor of a water table rising, and the water now gushing forth from many springs, and then feeding back into the water table that rises still further. So, my awakening to this way of looking at the world came through not only intellectual influences but personal experiences too, that gave me direct experiential confirmation that reality isn't quite what I was taught, in my education or by the culture. And once I had a few experiences that confirmed my suspicion that there was more to this than I was being told, then I began to question everything. And also, I came from a politically radical family, somewhat radical anyway. And I was aware at a young age that there was something profoundly wrong with the world, and wanted to understand the origin of the wrongness. And so I dug down. None of the answers that were proffered went deep enough, like Marxism, for example, or anti-civilization thinkers. None of them really went deep enough, and that's how I arrived at the world-generating mythology. But it was just like, often it was just like something as mundane as walking through a suburban neighborhood and like, where are all the kids? When I was a kid, this place would have been packed with kids playing outside. What happened? And I trace it to, television, air conditioning, the automobile, the homogenization of the economy that disconnects people from place. And it just goes down and down and down until I get to the myth of separation.
Charles, when you articulated that myth a minute or so ago, you noted the distinction between assuming that first individuals exist and then they happen to be deeply related to other things, and the idea that actually it's the relationships that are the origin of the individual. Can you say just a little bit more about that difference?
Yeah. I guess the naive Cartesian mind would like to have this kernel of self that is inviolate. And then there's the maybe outer layers of self that are formed through interactions with others in the world. And the way I came to understand it is that all the way down to the core, it is relationship, which means that I cannot insulate myself from the world or from other people. One of the delusions of technology and of technological progress is that we could, in theory, we could destroy nature, destroy the rainforests, poison the earth, but or oppress other populations. And if we can build a complete enough bubble around ourselves, we'll be able to insulate ourselves from those effects. So we destroy the biosphere, well, no problem. We can make artificial food. It's already being developed in, it's called precision fermentation. We don't need nature anymore. We can alter the climate. We can bleach the sky white with sulfur aerosols. We could have bubble cities, bubble suits, protect ourselves from the world, and exert our mastery and dominance over the world. That is a product of thinking that there is this kernel of self separate from the world. Like what happens to you, what happens to the rainforest, what happens to the whales need not affect me. But when I understand that my very existence is at its core part of the existence of the whales, then, or the, people in Yemen or somewhere else, then I know that whatever happens to them is in some way happening to me, because my existence is relational. I don't know if that is helpful.
That makes such sense to someone like me, influenced by Whitehead, because his idea is that we live moment by moment. Our very selves are not substantial selves that endure unchanged from birth to death, but rather we're different at each moment, and we're constituted by our experience. And then he has a further idea that every experience at every moment begins with what he calls experience in the mode of causal efficacy. And that's his way of saying that in the beginning are the many of the world, the many of the universe, the many of this location. And they give rise, in a sense, to us. It's not that first we exist in the moment and then reach out to the world. It's that first the world exists and then gives rise to us. And that giving rise, he calls experience in the mode of causal efficacy.
Yeah.
He thinks that it's largely unconscious. There's a lot to experience besides conscious experience for Whitehead. There's a whole realm, moment by moment, by which we're influenced and shaped by what is other than us and are born from what is other than us. So that makes a lot of sense to me. One question that can emerge for a lot of folks is, I get that, and I see how unique that way of thinking is, but there's also the sense of individuality. There's also the sense that I respond to the world that helps create me. Where in your thought, is there place in your thought for that autonomy, for that, if not independence, then at least agency of the self?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, it gets really metaphysical, but there's one interpretation of quantum mechanics that basically says it may look to us that there's, nearly infinite number of electrons out there, but there's actually only one electron popping in and out of existence. It's like all of the electrons are the same electron. And I guess if you follow supersymmetry down to the bottom, maybe all existence is just one particle. So by the same token, we might understand each of ourselves as attention, looking out onto the world from a different shifting locus in the matrix of relationships. And then the question is, well, how is my attention any different from your attention? Ultimately, it's the same attention. So that means that and this is a venerable spiritual teaching in certain lineages. What it means is that perhaps you could consider that our only real agency and choice is the choice of what to pay attention to. And that all of our other apparent choices come through come as an automatic product. This is the teaching of the automaticity of man. Come as the automatic product of what we have created ourselves to be through the exercise of attention. And so it's the dualistic mind has trouble grasping this paradox that in essence, our choice of what to pay attention to is God making the choice of what to create. So the agency, my agency is not separate from your agency or from God's agency. Yet that does not invalidate the experience of agency. So I don't know. I mean, it can get really confusing because the concepts that we're invoking they have separation built into them. So
well, we have full permission in this podcast to be as metaphysical as we want. So we can we can go there again and again. I'm going to turn to some of the 5 issues that I sent you before this podcast. And the first was called Trusting in the Logic of the Heart. And I'll try to link that with what we've been talking about so far. It's one thing to say everything's interconnected. Everything forms a systematic whole, whatever we want to say, but it's an object of the intellect. It's something I understand intellectually. I can draw diagrams. I can nod my head in assent to the proposition everything's interconnected. But that's very different from feeling the interconnectedness, from knowing it emotionally, spiritually, existentially, from the heart. What place does that kind of knowing, the logic of the heart, have in your own way of thinking?
Yeah, thank you for that question. Yeah, it's not like I'm saying, okay, here's the self, and I make a diagram, and it's a holograph, and look, there's a bit of you inside of me and me inside of you, and we're all evolving together. And like, yes. But if that's all you have, then you're not going to be able to make accurate choices just based on that. But I think the utility of articulating an intersubjective, interbecoming, interbeing model is that it validates the logic of the heart, because our hearts understand, in our hearts, we understand that we're not separate. We understand that our personal interactions and our invisible choices are significant, that every action has an effect, that the person before me is important, even if my received causal logic based on Newtonian forces cannot explain why is it important to visit my mother and sit with her day after day as she's going through the dying process. Like, the mind of separation does not understand that. Like, well, she's going to die anyway. I should spend my time with kids if I want to have an effect on the future. No one's going to know ever what words were spoken between me and my mother in those moments. So so the mind that has been, other cultures would not have this problem, but the logic that our minds have absorbed growing up and being educated in what's still a Newtonian paradigm. And I can elaborate on that if you want me to, but I'll just assert it right now. That logic does not allow for the heart's knowing that this is the most important thing I could be doing right now. So the purpose of this philosophy, I think, is to end the war between the mind and the heart. Because when we have this other model, this other story, then it validates what the heart knows. So the heart's communication to the mind is through the emotions, through the feelings, especially the feeling of care, the feeling of love. And it's hard to listen to that sometimes, because sometimes it contradicts the logic of separation. Like, it could be, for example, a generous act. And the mind's like, well, hold on, I'm not going to be okay if I do that. I can't afford to do that. That's irrational. That person's just going to use the money to get drunk anyway, et cetera, et cetera. And maybe they will, and maybe they won't. And how do you know that maybe that gesture of, yeah, go get yourself a drink, maybe that is a violation of that person's world where everybody's in it for themselves and is judging them. And maybe that is a seed that someday sprouts into rehabilitation. Like, we don't know. How do we know? This world is so complex. This is partly Ilya Prigoghine's influence. That I read his work when I was very young. Sensitive dependence on initial conditions, and like, how do you know? Do we have any possible way of knowing? And I think the answer is yes. We have a holistic organ that that is an organ of a vast orchestrating intelligence. It's a communicating organ to us. It listens to get a little Steinerian here. You could say that the blood absorbs all of this information, and then it passes through the heart, which is primarily, if you listen to Steiner, it's not actually a pump. The heart receives and passes forth, but it can't actually pump a viscous liquid through miles of tiny capillaries. Impossible. It receives, and the motion of the blood is generated by the body, not by the heart. So it receives all of this information, and then through all of its hormones and things, it sends messages and peptides. It sends messages out through the body, but it's a listening organ in this literal biological sense, but also in a larger sense of integrating all that is happening and communicating it to our minds.
I'd like to affirm what you just said and put it briefly in Whiteheadian terms, which resonate, I think, with what you're saying. So a word about heart knowledge. In a Whiteheadian context, there are at least two kinds, both of them quite valuable. And one is empathy. And in Whiteheadian context, it's actually feeling the feelings of others. A sense of what their psychological states are, what their emotions are, what their intentions are, what their attitudes are, what their sufferings are, what their joys are. And in a Whiteheadian context, we actually do at every moment, actually, feel the feelings at least of our own past, but also the feelings of others. So it's empathy. And that precedes intellection. That precedes analysis, which is also good, but it precedes it. The other kind of heart knowledge in Whitehead is a kind of knowing of what to do in the situation at hand, whatever that situation is. And Whitehead speaks of that as the initial aim within experience. And that's technical terminology, but he thinks that it derives from the cosmic intelligence, the cosmic wisdom, the cosmic life. And that for him is God. So if you imagine God as a kind of the cosmic wisdom of the universe, but also with consciousness, he believes. We experience God as that possibility, as the knowing of that possibility to do what is needed in the circumstance at hand, whatever that is. So empathy and that kind of discernment, I think in a Christian context, that's traditionally called discernment, discerning what to do in the moment at hand. I would say those are two forms of heart knowledge. I don't know if that makes sense to you, but
yeah, that's totally congruent. The what I was saying about the integration of all like this information, this divine information, it doesn't have to be limited to some supernatural force. But you could also say that it is the sum total of everything happening in the world or in the universe, even in the cosmos, that is received by the blood and then by the heart. And that totality of information is what you need to make an accurate choice that takes all of that into account. And that this So choice is actually the native function of the heart. We're supposed to choose from our hearts. Our ideology, the ideology of modernity and especially of economics, contravenes that truth and offers instead this elaborate cost-benefit mode of choice making, which is made explicit in economics, the theory of the firm, the theory of the rational individual, where you seek to maximize rational self-interest. the irony is that even if you say, yes, I'm here to maximize rational self-interest, you still don't know even how to do that through a process of ratiocination. You don't have enough information. You can't integrate that amount of information. So it becomes this delusion where you think that you're pursuing rational self-interest and you get more and more miserable as an individual, and look at our society too. By every measure, actually that's changing even too, but for a long time, by every measure, our society was progressing. Per capita GDP, lifespan, educational levels, et cetera, et cetera. And, obviously to give expression to our growing sense that things are not progressing, we have to expand our metrics. Anyway, that's a whole other, I'm not going to get into that right now, but and as for empathy, this is the question that I offer now, especially in these polarized times. What is it like to be you? And that basically it gives permission to us to listen to this heart knowledge.
Yeah.
That question is an invitation. It's an orientation.
Yeah.
Because we can't reason out what it's like to be you. But in fact, and politically, it's a little incorrect to say that you could ever know what it's like to be, a Black person or a handicapped person or this or that. But everybody knows and has had the experience of empathy where in that moment you do know what it's like to be somebody else. Mm-hmm. Without that, as a society, we're lost. Because without that, all we have is our projections, our presumptions, our judgments, our categorizations, which are usually dehumanizations of the enemy. And how is democracy possible when we reduce each other?
Well, I just agree. On the what is it like to be you? For my part, I find it helpful to ask somebody, what kind of music do you like? What do you enjoy listening to? So I want to know about the suffering, but I also want to know about the joy. I want to know what you enjoy. And tell me your story. You talk, I'll listen. You talk. Mm-hmm. And you don't have to get it right the first time or the second or the third. I'll listen again. So I wonder if democracy doesn't require a capacity for rather deep listening. And if we can be educated into that in a way, because, in our family situations, some of us are in family situations where we're invited to listen and think of listening as a good thing, and some not. So I want to turn to nature in a second, Charles, but do you want to respond to anything I just said before we turn to the more than human world?
We could talk the whole time just about that, and what prevents us from listening. Mm-hmm. The trauma, there's a lot of healing that has to happen to recover the capacity to listen.
Well, we'll leave that there, but we can return anytime we want to that. In a Whiteheadian context, but I think in your context as well, from your perspective, we can listen to more than the human because there's something like an energy, something like an aliveness. Whitehead would say feeling. There's actually something like feeling in the hills and the rivers and the trees and the stars and the plants and, of course, the other animals.
Yeah.
Did you want to say anything about your sense of an organic universe where all things are living? If that's how you see things. If not, how do you see things?
Yeah, thank you. Part of one of the things that I write and speak about, depending on the occasion, is to upend the hierarchy of being that we've inherited. And that goes back thousands of years, that puts human beings at the apex of beingness and denies other beings full full subjectivity. Really, that's what it comes down to. It says that animals, that maybe they have some beingness, some subjectivity. Plants, they're just kind of vegetative. And of course, rocks or clouds or, the sun, these are not beings at all. So that puts us in the Cartesian position of being the lords and possessors of nature. And if there is no beingness or intelligence or sentience outside the human, or at least the animate world, then there's no reason not to order that world according to our own self-interest, which even in Whiteheadian terms is unrelated. There's no self, even, there's no other selves out there to be in real relation to, if they're not beings. If it's just I can't even raise an example. I can't even make an analogy, because here I could say if it's just like a brick, here's a brick, like that is the metaphor for an insensate being. But if you go into a childlike mind and you're like, well, what is it like to be this brick? And you tune into it, you will have an experience. Something will be knocking at the door that you have to deny with effort. And it might bring up the echo of traumas when that knowing and that experience of being in an enchanted world full of beings was denied as children. It's not nourished in this culture. So I can't even say we're treating the world as if it were just a bunch of bricks, because bricks aren't just a bunch of bricks either. So, yeah, to understand, now it's not to say that a brick has the same consciousness as a human. It's the experience of being a brick is very different than the experience of being a human. But this reversal of anthropocentrism, that doesn't deny the specialness of human beings. It's not to make ourselves unimportant. Actually, we are very important. We are a new creation of nature, and not dispensable. In the environmental movement, there's this idea that Earth would be better off without us, which is at a deep level a denial of the intelligence of nature that is in fact part of the problem. But when we understand that nature is purposeful, that and you could put it in theologic terms too, that there is a God in all things, that there is intelligence in all things as an entirety, and in each of these things as well, but also in all things, then you understand that there's an intelligence to our being too. Why are we here? That becomes a question that we don't ask if our ideology says that there's no answer. And the ideology that still prevails today, in say it's Darwinian form, it's, well, we're an accident and we're here to be here. We're here to survive, to reproduce. Even the concept of a purpose, there's no teleology even possible in a Newtonian Darwinian worldview. Not that Newton or Darwin actually would necessarily subscribe to that. Newton was, of course, a mystic, and Darwin was a deeply humble man who did not presume to know everything. But as long as we're trapped in those ideologies, we don't even ask the question, why are we here? And that is a scary question. It is a subversive question. When people in our society start asking that question, they stop conforming to the expectations of the world-destroying machine. It's a troublesome question. And that trouble goes all the way to the base level of our mythology. And this is the question we need to start asking. Because if we do not have a collective purpose here, that a source of meaning that we can that we can all draw from in making meaning of our own lives, then we're not going to have any coherence. And it will become true that we are just here to survive, to reproduce, to maximize self-interest. That becomes true when we subscribe to the story in which it's true. And so one part of my intentions in doing my work is simply to open up that question and to validate our hearts knowing that it has an answer. There is a reason why we are here. We were created intelligently. Everybody knows this on some level. That's why that question, why am I here, becomes so powerful the longer it is denied. It's called a midlife crisis.
Well, you put that so beautifully, and I think I'm going to put that in a Whiteheadian way, but it certainly doesn't. It's not going to match the way you put it, but it might be interesting for you to know. Whitehead believed that we live in a teleological universe, and the universe does indeed have purpose. And one word that he used to name that purpose is beauty. And so he thinks there's a lure toward beauty within the depths of the universe, felt no less by the atoms as by the porpoises, as by the people. And it's a lure toward satisfying existence in relation to the rest of the world, and in a spirit of harmony and intensity. And he also believed in God. And Charles, a lot of people think of God as something supernatural, but that's not Whiteheadian language. He thought that nature is more enchanted, bigger than we often realize. And nature includes a universe that has a mind or a soul. There's a soul of the universe. And the aim of that soul is for the realization of beauty in finite ways, everywhere. And in the human sphere, that can take the form of love. So to give my life to the great work of helping to add whatever beauty is possible, and add whatever love is possible. That Whitehead thinks that's not a figment of my imagination, but actually responding to the very purposiveness that's within the depths of things.
Yes.
I don't know how that sounds to you. But
Yes. Yeah. If I had to give an answer to the question, why are we here? It's the same answer that all beings are here for. It's to contribute to life and beauty on Earth and ultimately beyond Earth. That's why we're here. And that's what, if the history of this planet is that it becomes more and more and more alive. And each new kind of being contributes to that. So multicellular organisms, they made the planet more complex. There were more relationships because of these. Flowering plants, like whatever, and human beings also. Now, so far, we've made the world less alive, but we are a new expression, at least in potential, of complexity. And we are a vehicle for new forms of beauty. And we can see that does not have to come at the expense of other beauty. Like we can see examples of the works of human minds and hands that actually contribute more to the beauty, like a Taoist temple. It doesn't detract from the landscape. It's not this thing that's plopped on that mars the landscape, but it enhances the landscape. It's a sacrament. And so we can see that the purpose of humanity ultimately is inseparable from living in a ceremonial, sacramental way, that everything we do is a gift that redeems the gift that we've received, the gift of life. That's why one of the main themes that I work with is gift, and applying it to economics, but also ecology, and also to art, human purpose. That our we are here as a gift, and that not only that, we are a gift. We are a gift to the world, and each one of us also, in that sense as well, we are a gift to the world. And it's, hasn't seemed that way looking at what humans have done to the planet, yet there are counterexamples that we can draw from as we awaken as a civilization, as we awaken to that purpose. So yeah, I would concur with Whitehead here on that.
I taught the world's religions to college undergraduates for 39 years. So I think in terms of the world's religions, and I know that both you and I have some background in East Asian, or at least I do in East Asian context. I was the English teacher for a Zen Buddhist priest from Kyoto for many years and was reading Whitehead as I was actually teaching him English, et cetera. So all that's part of my framework. And I say that because I'm about to use a Christian word, and I just don't want to suggest that that's the only word available, but Christians have the word grace.
Yes.
And to learn to see the world as grace. Grace as the gift of others in their diversity and beauty and nourishment to your life, and the grace that you might also share with them, contributing to them. So I wonder, do you see connections between grace and gift in your own mind?
Yeah. I love the word grace because I don't quite know what it means. There's something elemental about it that can't be reduced to other words and other definitions. It definitely has something of the nature of gift. Like if you say by the grace of God, it means that it's not that you earned it. It's not that you submitted an order for this thing to come. There's a recognition, in fact, that like for me, it's a hesitancy actually even to pray, because who am I to know what this world really needs? So another way I understand grace, so it's like things that come as the gift of God. But another way I understand grace is simply to do things more beautifully than they need to be done for any good reason. Why would somebody need to set the table gracefully? And they do that not because they're making a performance of it, not because somebody's watching, I'm only going to do it gracefully then. That kind of fake grace isn't actually that impressive. It has to come from a place that where it's a way of being that does it whether or not somebody's looking. And you can detect that, whether it is or is not that. So it's a kind of a cultivation. And I think that ultimately it's the cultivation of acting in alignment with the beauty that wants to become in the world.
I think of your example or of someone going to see their mother, their aging mother. I have that certainly in my life. Going to see my aging mother, age 101, when she died, and being at her bedside and going to see her before that and singing to her and praying with her. And there was something beautiful about that, even though the death is sad also. But there's something quite beautiful. There's a poignancy. And it doesn't need to be recognized. No one needs to name it. No one needs to say thank you. Thank you is a very beautiful phrase, but nobody needs to say that because it comes from the heart in a kind of good way. And that's what I hear. That's what I hear. I also love the phrase, Charles, elemental grace. May I recommend that you have that as the title to your next book? And so the grace of the hills and the rivers and the trees and the stars and the atoms and the giving, the spontaneous, unasked for Dessert is not an issue. That's not even a relevant question. But it's kind of
so beautiful, we wouldn't even know to ask for it.
Right. Yeah.
That's the level of gift. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's come down to earth in our last, we've been on the earth the whole time. Let's enter more deeply into earth in the last, I know that you've got a side of you that's been involved with community animation, the development of local communities, concern for economics, concern for agriculture. Do you want to say anything in way of closing about what the great work looks like socially today in terms of fostering healthy communities? Anything on your mind you want to share?
It starts with upholding the value of community and the value of relationship. If I may make a allusion to our current public health situation and priorities, we are now in a time where our collective response to COVID has been to do everything we can to preserve existence, to extend life, to minimize risk. And as we do that, other values fall by the wayside that in a healthy society might be more important or as important as death avoidance and risk minimization. And I would like for us to, and I think this ultimately comes down again to our basic mythology, because in that mythology, there is no purpose and existence is not relational. So of course, you're going to live to minimize risk and preserve the separate self as long as possible. And it's hard to see from that place that maybe hugs and faces and gatherings and singing together and dancing together and performance arts and like to see that those are important, because their importance, their value is invisible from preserving life as long as possible. And we have a medical system in which the worst possible outcome is death. Other cultures did not think that the worst thing that could happen to you is death. In other cultures, the worst punishment was banishment. That was worse than execution, banishment, ostracism. No one looks at you. No one talks to you. You're shunned. That is an organic reflex of societies. So it's kind of like that's happening to everybody. And it's not going to change unless we, and this is not only applying to COVID-19, it's also applying to the way that we structure our economy, where we outsource relationships and make them into professional services. Things like taking care of children, things like play, things like recreation, music, food preparation, the building of houses, like everything is outsourced now. Whereas even when I was a kid, like we rarely paid for childcare. A neighbor could always watch the kids, that, and as that gets outsourced, the economy grows, GDP rises, and we're more and more lonely. So I guess this is another overarching theme, is to come back together again, to rebuild society in so that it embodies our growing consciousness of interbeing, of interconnection, of this relational nature of life, that we cannot actually be whole or happy without a full complement of relationships. And you can apply this in so many ways. You can apply it to, like, New England Journal of Medicine, recent article linking serious COVID symptoms with gut dysbiosis. Okay, so there's a community in your gut that when it is destroyed, you cannot be healthy. Or the biggest predictor of ill health and early death is loneliness. It's not drinking. You're better off drinking and smoking and being social than you are, living an abstemious, solitary life. So this is like, there's so many ways you can apply this and so I want to say that in congruence to process philosophy, to bring that into the world, it is time to uphold the values of relationship in every sense. Ecological, I could also talk about that. I could talk about how it applies to agriculture. Like in every field, this is the key that turns the lock. Restoring, honoring relationship, holding relationship sacred.
So I'm a lay associate in a Benedictine community in Fort Smith, Arkansas. And if you know anything about the Benedictines, one of their emphases is community and finding God in community and living in community without sentimentalizing it. It can be difficult, but something deep is known in community that's not known elsewhere. Mm-hmm. And so one of my favorite sisters at the monastery is a woman named Macrina Whitaker. And she just passed away. But one of the things she once said to me and to others is, if you live alone, whose feet will you have to wash? Because, in the Benedictine community, there's a ritual of foot washing. How could you imagine living without having other feet to wash?
Yeah.
And that was her way of saying, community isn't only that we're nourished by others, it's that we have the opportunity to nourish others.
And we need to do that. That's why we're here. That's part of,
right.
If you're not doing that, you will not be happy. If you're not contributing to life and beauty on earth, you'll always have the feeling that I'm not doing what I was put here to do. Yeah.
Hey, well, thank you so much for this conversation today. And may people listen to it and learn from you, and we'll be in further touch. Any last moment of guidance you want to offer us, or wisdom or thought that you want to share before we close?
I just want to thank you, Jay, for being such an incredible host. And I really enjoyed just seeing the love on your face for life and the world, and your kindness and graciousness and generosity. It really made me feel comfortable, and I feel grateful.
Well, you're very easy to be comfortable with. So thank you so much, Charles. Blessings abound.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Conversations in Process is a co-production of the Cobb Institute and Open Horizons. If you'd like to support this podcast and help us realize our aim to advance wisdom, harmony, and the common good, please consider making a donation by visiting cobb.institute. That's cobb.institute and clicking on the donate button.